Mysterious serial killer whose identity has long remained a mystery.
DNA from a shawl recovered at the scene of one of his crimes has incredibly found a 100% match.
For 137 years, the most famous killer in history had no face. Now, DNA evidence from a Victorian shawl points to a Polish barber named Aaron Kosminski, already on a police list in 1888. The study was peer-reviewed. Its authors called it a perfect match, and the man who invented DNA fingerprinting said the analysis was wrong. Both things are true. So, is Jack the Ripper finally identified? Or has the world been sold a story? The Autumn of Terror. To understand why a single piece of DNA evidence could land like a bombshell, you have to understand the size of the legend it threatened to shatter. In the autumn of 1888, in a London district called Whitechapel, a killer emerged from the fog and did something so brutal, so deliberate, and so anatomically precise that it terrified a city of 4 million people and then terrified the world. He killed at least 5 women between August and November of that year, and the press gave him a name that outlived every theory about who he was. They called him Jack the Ripper. The 5 women whose deaths are attributed to him, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were all killed in the same maze of narrow courts and blind alleys in the East End. Their throats were cut, their bodies were mutilated. The violence was not random. It was surgical, focused on the abdomen, and in some cases, organs were removed, which led the public to a conclusion that shaped the next century of speculation. They were right that the violence was extraordinary. They were wrong about almost everything else, as it turned out. The killer, people insisted, had to be a surgeon, or a butcher, or someone with anatomical training. The theories only grew wilder from there. One of the most enduring claimed the crimes were a royal cover-up, orchestrated by Freemasons to protect a secret child fathered by Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria. It had everything a great conspiracy needs: a prince, a secret, a hidden brotherhood, and ritual killings designed to look like the work of a lone madman. People loved it. People still love it. And it was almost certainly complete fiction. The truth was that Scotland Yard had almost nothing to work with. Fingerprints were barely a concept. There were no forensic labs, no way to test a bloodstain beyond confirming it was blood. The police had a whistle, a wooden truncheon, and their own 2 eyes. Against a man who moved through the fog like smoke, it was almost nothing. And so the phantom faded into history, a name without a face, a story without an ending. The case slid, decade by decade, out of the world of law and into the world of myth. And that is where it stayed, locked and sealed for 137 years, while every generation produced a new book, a new suspect, and a new confident author swearing that this time, finally, the case was closed. Every generation, the phantom slipped away again. So when 2 British scientists said they had done what Scotland Yard could not, using a technology the Victorian police could never have imagined, the world leaned in. Everyone wanted the same thing, a single name. So what did they find? The shawl and the businessman. What they found was buried in a single object, a faded, stained silk shawl that most people would have tossed into a box at an estate sale and forgotten. In 2007, a British businessman and author named Russell Edwards bought the shawl at auction. According to the story that came with it, the shawl had been found at the scene of Catherine Eddowes' death on the night of September 30th, 1888, and had been passed down through the family of a police officer who was said to have taken it from the crime scene. Edwards gave the shawl to Dr. Jari Louhelainen, a molecular biologist at Liverpool John Moores University, who specialized in extracting genetic material from historical crime scenes. Louhelainen used a technique that involved injecting a sterile solution into the weave of the fabric and then vacuuming it back out, pulling cellular material from deep inside the fibers without destroying them. The technique was delicate and inventive, designed to harvest genetic material that had been trapped inside the weave for over a century, theoretically protected from the surface, handling that had contaminated the outside of the fabric. What he found were traces of blood and what appeared to be semen, the latter presumably left by the killer. The blood, they believed, belonged to the victim. The semen did not. In 2014, Edwards used the unpublished test results to publish a book called Naming Jack the Ripper, in which he declared that the DNA pointed to a single man, Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber who had been a police suspect all along. Edwards said it was a perfect 100% match, but geneticists immediately complained that the claims were impossible to assess without the technical details, and for 5 years, the evidence sat in limbo. The peer review process, the gold standard of scientific credibility, had not yet touched it. Then, in March 2019, Lou Helanen and a colleague, David Miller of the University of Leeds, published the full analysis in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, a peer-reviewed publication. The paper described extracting mitochondrial DNA from the shawl and comparing it to genetic samples from living descendants of both Eddowes and Kosminski. The mtDNA matched, they wrote. It was, they argued, the most systematic and most advanced genetic analysis ever conducted on the case. The analysis also suggested the killer had brown hair and brown eyes, which aligned with an eyewitness description from 1888. To Edwards, the evidence was overwhelming. He announced that his search was over and that Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. The book became a bestseller, the claim became a headline, and then the scientists started asking questions that the book could not answer. If the DNA points to one man, who was Aaron Kosminski, and why was he already a suspect? The Polish barber. Aaron Kosminski was not a glamorous suspect, and that is part of what makes him plausible. He was born Aaron Mordka Kosminski in Poland, and he arrived in the Whitechapel district of London in 1881 with his brother, part of a wave of Jewish immigrants fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. He worked as a barber. In 1888, the year of the crimes, he was 23 years old, living in the same streets where the killings happened, close enough to walk to every crime scene. He was poor, he was foreign, and he was mentally unwell, which meant he fit the profile that the police and the public had already built in their heads. The East End was full of men like him, anonymous, struggling, and barely visible to the society around them. He was not unknown to the police. In fact, he was one of the suspects named in a confidential 1894 memorandum written by Chief Inspector Melville McNagton of Scotland Yard, who listed Kosminski among the 3 most likely candidates for the Ripper. The police had been watching him. They had reasons to suspect him. What those reasons were exactly, beyond his presence in the area and his mental state, has never been fully disclosed. The files, if they ever existed, have never been found or released, but they never arrested him because the evidence they had would not have supported a charge. Kosminski's life after 1888 was tragic. He deteriorated mentally, showing symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as paranoid schizophrenia. He was committed to a mental asylum, where he spent the remaining decades of his life. He died in 1919, at the age of 53, never charged with any crime, never convicted of anything, and never given the chance to defend himself against the accusation that would follow his name for more than a century after his death. If he was innocent, the DNA evidence has done him a profound injustice. If he was guilty, justice came 100 years too late. Now, the families of both the victim and the suspect are pushing for a formal inquest. Karen Miller, a direct descendant of Catherine Eddowes, provided the DNA sample that matched her ancestors' blood on the shawl. Amanda Poulos, a descendant of Kosminski's family, has said she is open to establishing the truth. Edwards has hired a legal team to apply for a fresh inquest, arguing that the DNA evidence provides what the 1888 investigation lacked: a scientific link between a named man and the crime scene. Whether the science is strong enough to support that link is a question that the most qualified experts in the world have already answered, and their answer was no. So does the science actually hold up, or does the strongest evidence have the deepest cracks. The man who invented DNA fingerprinting said it was wrong. The cracks are real, and the deepest one was found by the most authoritative voice possible. Sir Alec Jeffreys is not a fringe critic. He is the scientist who invented DNA fingerprinting in 1984, the technology that revolutionized forensic science and made the entire field of genetic identification possible. Without his work, the shawl DNA test could not exist, and he said the test was wrong. The problem Jeffreys identified was technical but devastating. Luhalainen had identified a specific genetic mutation on the shawl, which he labeled 314.1C, and claimed it was extraordinarily rare, occurring in only about 1 person in 290,000. If true, finding that mutation on the shawl and in Kosminski's descendant would be a statistical slam dunk. But Jeffreys and other experts said Luhalainen had made an error of nomenclature. The mutation should have been labeled 315.1C, and 315.1C is not rare at all. It is present in more than 99% of people of European descent. The statistical foundation of the entire identification collapsed. The mutation Luhalainen called a 1 in 290,000 needle in a haystack was, in reality, shared by almost everyone. Finding it on the shawl proved nothing. It was the genetic equivalent of finding oxygen in the air. That was not the only problem. Turi King, the geneticist who led the genome sequencing of King Richard III, reviewed the study and called it unpublishable. The paper did not list its primers, did not present its raw data, and raised questions about whether the work had been done in a proper forensic or ancient DNA laboratory. The core issue, King explained, was that the study relied on mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down only through the maternal line. Mitochondrial DNA can exclude a suspect, but it cannot positively identify one because thousands of people share the same maternal genetic profile. You can say it is not person X, you cannot say it is person Y. There was also the shawl itself. The 1888 police inventory of the items found at Catherine Eddowes' crime scene does not mention any shawl. The chain of custody is undocumented and broken. The fabric was handled bare-handed by a police officer's family for over a century, then by auctioneers, by Edwards himself, and by descendants of the victim who stood in the same room as it for 3 days. Photographs exist of people holding the shawl with their bare hands. In forensic science, that is called a contamination time bomb. Luhalainen conceded the chain of custody was broken and that the evidence, in his own words, would not be conclusive in a modern court. That sentence, spoken by the scientist who conducted the test, is the one that matters most. It is the sentence that should end every documentary about this case. So if the DNA is this contested, has anyone else come closer? The letters, the painter, and the dead end? The short answer is no. Every other attempt to identify the Ripper from DNA has run into the same wall, which is that 1888 left almost nothing testable behind. The most famous alternative theory came from the American crime novelist Patricia Cornwell, who spent years and a reported fortune arguing that the killer was the painter Walter Sickert. Her evidence rested partly on DNA recovered from letters supposedly written by the Ripper to the police and the press. The problem is that most experts believe the letters were hoaxes sent by pranksters and journalists, not by the killer, and the letters are the only other source of genetic material that has ever been tested in this case. DNA from a hoax letter tells you who wrote the hoax, not who committed the killings. Another genetic analysis of the letters suggested, improbably, that the Ripper might have been a woman. That claim, too, rested on the assumption that the letters were genuine, which they almost certainly were not. The two most famous letters, the Dear Boss letter that gave the killer his name, and the From Hell letter that accompanied half a human kidney, have been subjected to decades of analysis, and the consensus among forensic historians is that neither can be reliably connected to the actual killings. If the letters are fakes, then every DNA test performed on them is testing the faker, not the killer. The shawl, for all its problems, remains the only physical object ever subjected to modern DNA analysis in connection with the Ripper case. There is no other piece of evidence. No weapon was ever recovered. No clothing from the victims was preserved in a condition suitable for testing. The physical evidence from the Autumn of Terror, all of it, amounts to one disputed shawl and a pile of almost certainly forged letters. The crime scenes were processed in 1888 with hoses and blankets, not with sterile swabs and evidence bags. The Victorian police did not know what DNA was. The concept would not be discovered for another 65 years. This is the forensic reality of the Jack the Ripper case. The shawl is the best evidence that exists, and the best evidence is a piece of fabric whose provenance is disputed, whose chain of custody was broken, and whose DNA analysis was called flawed by the inventor of the technology it relied on. That does not mean the case is hopeless. It means the case is hard, in a way that most true crime documentaries are not honest about. They present the shawl as the key that unlocks the case. The shawl is a door with 3 broken hinges, and hinges, as any carpenter knows, are load-bearing. So, is the case actually solved, or are we just closer than we have ever been? The honest answer is that the case is closer to closed than it has ever been, and it is not closed. Aaron Kosminski is, by most measures, the leading suspect. He fits. He was there. He was watched. He was in the right place at the right time. He was on the police list. He matched the general description given by the one credible eyewitness. The DNA on the shawl, whatever its flaws, points in his direction and not away from it. If you had to place a bet on the identity of Jack the Ripper, Kosminski is where the smart money goes. But you should not take that bet to court. But betting is not proving. The DNA evidence, even in its published peer-reviewed form, has been challenged by the most authoritative voices in the field of genetic identification. The shawl may never have been at the crime scene. The genetic material on it may be contaminated by a century of handling. The mitochondrial DNA that links it to Kosminski also links it to thousands of other people who lived in London in 1888. And the scientist who did the testing said himself that the evidence would not be conclusive in a modern court. That sentence, spoken by the scientist who conducted the test, is the one that matters most. It is the sentence that should end every documentary about this case. The families of the victims want closure, and they deserve to be heard. Karen Miller, the descendant of Catherine Eddowes, has said simply, "We have the proof. Now we need the inquest to legally name the killer." That push for a formal inquest, denied once in 2022, is gaining momentum again. But an inquest is a legal proceeding, and legal proceedings require evidence that meets a standard the shawl DNA, in its current state, may not reach. A previous application was denied in 2022. A new one is being prepared. This is the boundary the case has arrived at. Science can tell us that a Polish barber living in Whitechapel in 1888 is a better candidate than a prince, a painter, or a surgeon. Science can tell us that the shawl carries genetic material from the right region, the right time, and possibly the right family. What science cannot do is close the gap between a strong suspicion backed by real science and a proven fact that would hold up in court, not with a contaminated shawl, not with a disputed mutation, and not with the man who invented the technology looking over its shoulder and shaking his head. The gap between suspicion and certainty is the gap this case has always lived in, and it is the gap it will probably die in. The DNA points to Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber, but the man who invented DNA fingerprinting said the analysis was flawed. The shawl may never have been at the scene, and the scientist who tested it said it would not convict in court. The case is closer to solved than ever. But is Kosminski the Ripper, or just the best suspect?